Marilyn Monroe and the end of her life when she sat down for the very last interview she would ever give. Nobody in that room knew it. Not the journalist, not her assistant, not even Marilyn herself, or so the world has always been told. But buried inside that conversation are lines, pauses, and confessions that decades later still send chills through anyone who reads them closely. This wasn't a glamorous photo shoot. This wasn't a scripted publicity stunt. This was a woman speaking with a strange, quiet honesty that almost nobody noticed at the time. And when you go back and actually study what she said, word for word, you start to realize something unsettling. She may have been trying to tell the world goodbye, in plain sight, and almost no one caught it. Today, we're breaking down that final interview, minute by minute, word by word. We're going to show you what was published, what was left out, and what historians, biographers, and journalists have pieced together in the decades since. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you will never read Marilyn Monroe's last words the same way again. It was the summer of 1962. Marilyn Monroe was 36 years old, and on paper, she had everything. She was the most photographed woman on the planet. Her face sold magazines by the millions. Her name alone could shut down a film set or open every door in Hollywood. But behind the cameras, something was unraveling. She had just been fired from her unfinished film, Something's Got to Give. 20th Century Fox was furious with her. Rumors about her health, her relationships, and her state of mind were spreading through the gossip columns like wildfire. And in the middle of all that chaos, a journalist named Richard Merriman walked into her life for what would become one of the most haunting interviews in entertainment history. Merriman was working for Life magazine. He wasn't there to dig up scandal. He was there for something quieter, a reflective personal conversation about what it actually felt like to be Marilyn Monroe. Over the course of several sessions in her Los Angeles home, he asked her questions most journalists never bothered to ask. Not about her films, not about her marriages. He asked her about fame itself, what it cost her, what it gave her, and what was left of the woman underneath it. What followed was unlike anything Marilyn had given before. She spoke slowly. She chose her words with unusual care. People who worked with her regularly later said this interview revealed a side of her they rarely saw on camera. Tired, reflective, almost philosophical. She talked about the public's obsession with her image and how exhausting it had become to constantly perform a version of herself that the world demanded but that she no longer fully recognized. At one point, she described fame as something strange and corrosive, something that could touch your soul, but mostly just bruised it. She talked about feeling like property, like something owned and used rather than someone respected. She spoke about wanting to be taken seriously as an actress, frustrated that so much attention went to her image and so little to her work. These weren't throwaway lines. These were the words of someone clearly wrestling with the gap between who she was and who the world had built her into. And then came the moment that, in hindsight, stopped people in their tracks. Near the end of the conversation, Marilyn made a request. She asked Merriman, almost as an afterthought, to leave one specific line out of the final published piece, a comment about wanting to be remembered and not forgotten the moment the cameras stopped rolling. It was a small human moment buried inside a much longer conversation. But weeks later, after the unthinkable happened, that single request would take on a meaning nobody could have predicted, because 3 days after that final conversation wrapped, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home. The world stopped. Newspapers across the globe ran her face on the front page. Fans gathered outside her house in stunned silence. And Richard Merriman, a journalist who had simply been doing his job, suddenly found himself holding the last extended interview the most famous woman in the world would ever give. Life magazine made the decision to publish it, not as a scandal piece, not as gossip. They ran it almost like a eulogy, just weeks after her death. Under the haunting title, Marilyn Monroe, the talk of Hollywood talks frankly about her career, her future, and herself. But because of the timing, every single sentence in that interview suddenly carried a new and devastating weight. Lines that would have been ordinary in any other context began to feel like warnings. Phrases about loneliness, about being used, about wanting to matter beyond her looks, all of it now read like a woman quietly trying to be understood before it was too late. Here's where the story gets even more interesting. For years, only parts of that interview were ever widely circulated. Certain quotes became famous, repeated endlessly in documentaries and books, while other sections sat largely forgotten in archives. It wasn't until decades later, when biographers and researchers went back to the original transcripts and recordings, that the full picture of that conversation started to come into focus. And what they found added new layers to a story most people thought they already knew. Merriman himself later spoke about the experience of interviewing her, describing a woman who was sharp, self-aware, and far more thoughtful than the dumb blonde persona the studios had spent over a decade selling to the public. He noted that she seemed acutely conscious of how she was perceived, almost performing a kind of self-analysis in real time, trying to explain to a stranger, and maybe to herself, how she had ended up trapped inside an image she helped create, but could no longer escape. This is the detail that historians keep coming back to. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just answering questions in that final interview. She was, in many ways, narrating the architecture of her own myth, brick by brick, while quietly hinting that the woman behind it felt increasingly invisible. Now, here's where this story extends far beyond Hollywood gossip. Marilyn Monroe's death, just days after that interview, didn't just shake the entertainment world, it triggered ripple effects that touched politics, government, and conspiracy theories that persist to this very day. Her rumored connections to powerful political figures, combined with the timing of her death so soon after her most revealing conversation with the press, fueled decades of speculation. Was there more she wanted to say? Was there pressure on her in those final days that went beyond personal struggles? Investigators, biographers, and amateur researchers have spent over 60 years chasing those questions, and the final interview remains one of the most scrutinized pieces of evidence in that ongoing debate. Even officials and historians who reject the conspiracy theories agree on one thing. That interview captured a woman at a breaking point, caught between enormous public adoration and a private life that was quietly falling apart. It forced Hollywood to reckon, even if only briefly, with how it treated its biggest stars, built up, consumed, and then discarded the moment they showed cracks. In the years following her death, journalists and industry insiders began asking harder questions about the pressures placed on young actresses, the control studios exerted over their personal lives, and the cost of manufacturing an image so powerful it eventually swallowed the real person underneath it. The reaction to this interview, once its full weight became clear, was nothing short of seismic. Fans who reread it after her death described feeling like they had missed obvious signs of distress, hidden in plain sight inside her own words. Fellow actors and friends who knew her personally said the interview finally gave them language for something they had sensed in her for months, but couldn't quite articulate themselves. Even journalists who had covered Hollywood for decades called it one of the most haunting pieces of celebrity journalism ever published, precisely because of how ordinary it felt to read at the time, and how impossible it became to read that way ever again. In the decades since, that final interview has been quoted in countless documentaries, books, and academic studies on fame, mental health, and the price of celebrity. Filmmakers have recreated those final conversations. Biographers have dissected nearly every sentence, searching for clues, warnings, or simply a clearer understanding of who Marilyn Monroe truly was beneath the image the world constructed around her. And new generations, discovering her story for the first time through clips and excerpts online, continue to be struck by how self-aware, intelligent, and painfully human she sounds, a stark contrast to the simplified caricature pop culture often reduces her to. Modern biographers who have studied the full transcript argue that the interview should be read not as a prophecy, but as an honest, if heartbreaking, snapshot of a woman exhausted by the machinery of fame. They caution against over-interpreting every line as a deliberate goodbye, noting that hindsight has a powerful way of reshaping memory and meaning. At the same time, they acknowledge that the timing alone, just 72 hours before her death, makes it almost impossible for readers not to search for deeper significance in every pause, every careful word choice, every moment where she seemed to be measuring exactly how much of herself to reveal. Mental health professionals who have since studied public accounts of her final weeks point to patterns common among people under extreme, sustained pressure, exhaustion, a sense of being unseen despite constant visibility, and a longing to be remembered for substance rather than surface. Whether or not Marilyn consciously knew how little time she had left, the interview captures someone grappling in real time with exactly those feelings, making it one of the most studied and emotionally resonant documents in the history of celebrity journalism. So where does this story go from here? Interest in Marilyn Monroe's final days has never actually faded, and if anything, it has intensified in recent years. New documentaries continue to dig through archival material, hoping to uncover unpublished notes, additional recordings, or overlooked details from that final interview and the days surrounding it. Estate representatives and historians periodically release previously unseen photographs and documents, each new discovery reigniting public fascination and renewed scrutiny of those final 72 hours. Researchers continue to comb through Richard Merriman's notes and personal recollections, hoping to find anything that didn't make it into the original Life magazine publication. There are also ongoing conversations within the entertainment industry itself, using Marilyn's story as a case study in how fame, media pressure, and personal well-being collide, conversations that feel even more relevant today in an era of constant celebrity visibility and relentless online scrutiny. Her final interview, once a quiet, overlooked piece of journalism, has become something far bigger, a permanent reference point for understanding the human cost behind the brightest spotlights in the world. What makes this story so powerful, even decades later, isn't a single shocking revelation or a hidden secret buried in a vault somewhere. It's the simple, devastating truth that the answers were there all along, spoken openly by Marilyn Monroe herself, just days before she died. She told the world exactly how exhausted she was. She told the world exactly how invisible she felt beneath all that glamour. Nobody was hiding anything. The world just wasn't listening closely enough at the time, and by the time everyone finally did, it was already too late. That's the haunting power of her final interview. It wasn't designed as a farewell. It wasn't written as a warning. But because of when it happened, and because of what she chose to say, it became something far more powerful than either of those things. A final, honest portrait of a woman the entire world thought it already knew, revealing more about who she really was than anyone realized until it was far too late to do anything about it. This is a story that keeps revealing new layers, even after 60 years, so make sure you're subscribed, stay tuned, and keep watching, because the truth about Marilyn Monroe's final days is still being uncovered, and we'll be the first to bring it to you the moment it breaks.